Kia ora, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We'll just let everyone come on in and we'll start maybe a couple of minutes after 12 o'clock. Kia ora, welcome. I can see the numbers ticking up at the bottom of my screen. We'll get started in a little bit. Okay, we'll get started. Kia ora koutou. I am Amelia Sharman, Director of Sustainability Reporting, and I have Karen Tipper, Technical Director Assurance, here with me today. And we're really looking forward to going through this webinar with you, so welcome online with us. So what we're going to do today is talk about what was proposed, the feedback that was received, a summary of what was decided, and then we'll go through each decision and talk about what we heard and how it contributed to the decision, and then a bit of myth busting. And we're hoping to finish in time for plenty of Q&A. So please, housekeeping for the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording plus these slides will be made available on the XRB website next week. And please put your questions in the Q&A function, and Karen will be doing all the questions. And a reminder that the amending standards that we're talking about are available on our website, and on the last slide of this pack we have links to those amending standards. And to begin, just a quick reminder about why we consulted. So we heard that more time was needed for some of the reporting requirements because of challenges with obtaining reliable data and how to disclose in the absence of comprehensive guidance on certain topics. So firstly, what was proposed? Proposal 1, extending the adoption provision for Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions disclosures by 1 more year. Proposal 2, a new adoption provision delaying mandatory Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions disclosure assurance. Proposal 3, extending the adoption provision by 1 year for anticipated financial impacts. And Proposal 4, extending the adoption provision for transition planning by 1 year. And just an important point to note here is that proposals 1, 3, and 4 would exist in perpetuity because they are adoption provisions that would be available to entities that join the regime at any point in the future. But proposal 2 was time-bound and only applicable for accounting periods ending before 31 December 2025. So what did we hear? We are really grateful for all the feedback. Thank you so much. If there are people out there who submitted on the consultation, we couldn't do this without you. We got 106 written submissions, and that was pretty well split between the submission letters and the responses to the online survey. And as you can see there, the majority of submissions received were from listed entities. And that link there is to the submissions. They're all available on our website, so you can read those. And throughout this webinar, we'll be having some quotes just so you can get a flavour of what we heard. And of that 106, 63 were climate reporting entities. So we had a really good representation from climate reporting entities. And then we also got quite excellent feedback verbally through some drop-in sessions that we held and some targeted workshops and meetings with a variety of entities and others. So in terms of a summary of what was decided, Proposal 1 was agreed. So as proposed, a 1-year extension to the adoption provision for Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions disclosure. Proposal 2, again as proposed, a new 1-year adoption provision relating to the assurance of Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. Proposal 3, as proposed, a 1-year extension to the adoption provision for anticipated financial impacts disclosures. And Proposal 4 was to retain the status quo, so no extension to the existing adoption provision for transition planning, and we will explain the reasons for that later on. So I'm going to hand over to Karen, who's going to talk through the decisions around Proposal 1 and Proposal 2.
Thank you, Amelia. And it's my pleasure to talk through the decisions behind the first proposal, which was delaying the mandatory Scope 3 GHG emissions disclosures. So on the next slide, we have a summary of a few things that we heard directly from the submitters. And as you can see, this is a summary of very different views. Just a reminder here that the slides and the recording will be available on our website next week. So please don't feel that you really have to quickly digest everything that's in all of these quotes. But just as a summary, we heard huge support for delaying this adoption delaying the disclosure of GHG emissions disclosure by 1 year. 81% of people supported the delay. And the comments from respondents, as you can see, were very varied. And that brings me on to the next slide, which is going to talk through the key issues that the XRB board considered as they made their decision. So the first thing that they considered was that an extension would allow for more accurate, reliable, and quality data to be available. So this would give the time for more reliable data to be available. And most of the respondents focused on not reporting until they considered that they had reliable, accurate, or quality data. It also gives the delay will enable time for entities to put in place effective controls, processes, and systems, and these will enable their Scope 3 GHG emissions data to be collected and reported on, and for any new systems or processes to be established where necessary. The XRB also considered specific concerns raised by managed investment schemes or MIS managers, and they expressed concerns with assessing reliable data. So a delay by 1 year would allow more time for the level of company reported emissions data to mature so that MIS managers can draw from more accurate and reliable data sources. So on the next slide, as Amelia said at the start, the decision was to proceed with what we exposed and to give a 1-year extension to the existing adoption provision. So there were a few things that were noted as part of this decision. The first thing, and we're sort of talking, as we talked about at the start, about talking through some myths and busting some myths. The first one was that we need to wait until we have accurate emissions data before we disclose. And one of the things that we have considered is that GHG emissions data will always have inherent uncertainty and estimation within it. So by its very nature, it contains this uncertainty, and this uncertainty is acceptable under NZCS, and NZCS acknowledges and allows for this. But what this decision will give is more time for entities to get ready and for us at the XRB to provide further implementation guidance. One of the other myths that we heard is that GHG emissions accounting is the same as financial accounting. And we wanted to say that this is not the same, and one example of this is restatements. So in financial accounting, restatements are not common. They are usually as a result of error, whereas in greenhouse gas emissions accounting, they are more common and can be as a result of a change in methodology, and restatements are considered important for trend analysis and to show reductions. Another thing we heard is that we need direct Scope 3 emissions data before we can disclose. But under the commonly used greenhouse gas measurement standards, entities are able to use various estimation techniques, and these include spend-based or activity-based methods and emission factors. And now I will move on to the decisions behind the new proposed adoption provision for greenhouse gas emissions assurance. So for this, as it was a new adoption provision, we actually asked 2 questions. We asked, was there support for a 1-year adoption provision to delay Scope 3 GHG emissions assurance for 1 year? And would 1 year be enough for systems to mature and to support the reliability of data and enable greater consistency of practice? And as you can see from the quotations on the slide, again, we had very differing views, and we had 81% support for proceeding with giving a new adoption provision for 1 year. So on the next slide, the key issues that the XRB board considered when they looked at this was they were again considering whether this will enable time for the CREs to put in place effective controls, processes and systems, and enable those entities to be able to collect and report on their Scope 3 emissions. We heard mixed views about whether a 1-year delay would be long enough for systems to mature adequately to support the availability. We also heard information from third-party providers that there would be an opportunity for assurance practitioners to rely on service organisation control reports, and that these should be available within the year. And these service organisational control reports would cover the description, design and operating effectiveness of the controls at the service provider. And we also had submissions that assurance practitioners submitted that there is adequate resource in the assurance market. So the reason that one's on there is that there was, in some of the submissions, there was a perceived perception that there was not, that there may not be enough resource in the market. So we move on to the next slide. And as before, the decision was to proceed with a new 1-year adoption provision for the assurance of Scope 3 greenhouse gas disclosures. And this acknowledges, as with the decision to proceed with the 1 year for greenhouse gas disclosures, that there will always be inherent uncertainty and a high degree of estimation. And this is given the nature of the Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. So this is acknowledged within the assurance standards. There are specific paragraphs that talk about inherent uncertainty, and this is accounted for within those standards. Just a point of clarification, if the adoption provision is used by an entity, the Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions disclosures are still required to be assured and are required to be the subject of an assurance engagement. And we also understand that the FMA will undertake a targeted consultation on a class exemption to support the certainty of this 1-year extension. And now I will hand over to Amelia to talk about financial impact.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. So yes, I'll talk about proposals 3 and 4. So proposal 3 was about delaying anticipated financial impact disclosures. As you can see on the screen, some people thought it wouldn't be enough, some people thought it would be really important, and other people thought that this was a particularly important bit of information and must be disclosed immediately. So in terms of written submissions received, 88% agreed to the delay, 9 didn't, and the remainder were either unsure or did not answer. The key issues that the XRB board considered on this topic was that there was strong support in the submissions for more time, not only for the disclosure, but for the underlying analysis that supports the disclosure of anticipated financial impacts. So it's really about those robust processes and the data to be gathered to enable people to make more confident disclosures. There was also very strong support for further guidance from the XRB. Importantly to note that there is guidance out there, on anticipated financial impacts, but really strong support for guidance targeted to the New Zealand regime. There was definitely a strong message of learning by doing as an important part of this regime as a whole, but specifically for both anticipated financial impacts and transition planning that I'll get to next. And finally, another really key point that we heard was that while data tools and methods do exist for entities to draw from, it can be a really complex analysis, and it was a big heavy lift, to start doing the climate reporting. And if we give just a little bit more time for this one, that would be greatly appreciated. So, as I said before, yes, the XRB board decided to proceed with the proposal of the 1-year extension. But important things that we want to note is that, while this lack of guidance on specifics to the New Zealand regime is a really compelling reason to allow more time, learning by doing is really important, and that is what we have heard from those entities that have been voluntarily disclosing for a while, that this is something that they really only really got to grips with once they started doing it. So a message from us is that, this additional time really does need to be used by entities. You need to do the underlying work so that you will be prepared and ready for disclosure if you do use this adoption provision. And we are prioritising guidance on this, and we're really aiming to get that out to you as soon as possible. In terms of some of the myths, we heard that, you need to have a precise number before you can disclose, and that's definitely not true. Ranges are to be expected in this type of disclosure. We would not expect, precise numbers. This is definitely an uncertain forward-looking disclosure. Really, and also a reminder that in NZCS3 there are, requirements around methods, assumptions, and uncertainty, etc. And we would expect you to kind of combine a disclosure around this with that type of disclosure. In terms of unable to do so, in terms of that, there's a requirement. There's an allowance in the standards, if you're unable to quantify. It doesn't mean you're not planning to do anything. It's really, must be a genuine reason in our view, and it's not a blanket exemption that you just don't want to do it. It's really, why is this particular information unable to be quantified? And finally, there was a myth that you need to use a model, or you need to involve financial modelling experts for this. No, a model is definitely not necessary to do this type of analysis, but, some climate reporting entities may choose to use them. It could be part of a much more mature risk assessment, but if you're going to go down that route, you would really imagine that the people involved in your scenario risk work would be involved in that too. And then moving on to the delaying of the transition planning disclosures. This was really interesting. We heard some really, really interesting views on transition planning, and there were very clear differences in the views from different types of submitters. So of written submissions received, 82% did agree to the delay, 16% did not, and the remainder were either unsure or did not answer. And you can see here, some people wanted more time. Some people said, look, they're going to be work in progress for the foreseeable. Also, some really focused on the fact that primary users find this information particularly valuable. So the key things that the XRB board considered on this proposal was that, yes, most respondents did support the delay. However, most of that support was based on an understanding that this disclosure on transition planning requires this, fully fledged, certain and finished plan, rather than really understanding what transition planning is designed to be about, which is an iterative and dynamic process, with the disclosure reflecting that over time, because it's about disclosing where you're at. There was a very strong demand from primary users for this information. They found it was they argued that it's a really critical way to assess entities' maturity, level of commitment, and the efforts to avoid capital misallocation. And, that is what we're here for at the External Reporting Board, which is to make information available to primary users. So that was a very important consideration for the board. And as I said before, those entities that had already started transition planning emphasised the learning by doing aspect, and that it was actually a really important conversation starter about the entire climate-related disclosure regime, both internally and with primary users. So the decision was to retain the status quo on this, really around that strong primary user demand for this information. We were really weighing up the costs and benefits to preparers as well as to users. But, that very strong demand was important, and also this idea that we heard quite strongly from some submitters that this information is the most important around avoiding broader risks to the financial system. So yes, more guidance may be needed as entities progress, and there is guidance from the XRB that already exists, and more is coming very, very soon. The guidance that is readily available is sufficient for most entities to start disclosing. We do have some guidance on getting started on transition planning. That has been available for more than a year, so we really do encourage you to go to our resources page under the climate section of our website and have a look at that. So in terms of the myth busting, as I said, there was this idea that transition planning is this end point of the whole climate disclosure process. And, whilst it is, it's a so what, what have you learnt? It really should be understood as an iterative and dynamic process. And what is your primary user likely to find material at this point in your process of transition planning? We also, heard this idea that you need to have your scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions precisely calculated to be able to start transition planning. And again, no, while having a good grasp of your scope 3 emissions can be an important part of the picture for some entities, that really precise data is not required to understand the main source of emissions in your value chain. It's really about what are the key areas of risk, how can I start, talking about those. And as I said before, this myth that transition planning is a precise plan. Transition planning is a strategic process. It's really about improving your resilience to climate change, thinking about what you're going to do as the global and local economy transitions. And it's not possible, to plan out precise details over long time frames and with such level of uncertainty. So what really is the key around transition planning is giving primary users a sense of what you're planning to do to manage, and acknowledge this uncertainty over that short, medium, and long term. And as I said, there is going to be more guidance coming out very, very soon on both the disclosure and other aspects of transition planning. And as I said, we've got the Getting Started Guide on transition planning. There's a guide for directors that we published jointly with the Institute of Directors that, I really do recommend that you have a look at if you haven't seen that already. And then one additional point that we wanted to talk about was that there were, across the different proposals, requests for more time than we proposed. So we heard, 1, 2, 3, 4 more, potentially even up to 6+ years for some of these disclosure requirements. And we really, really did carefully and closely consider those under each specific proposal. And really where we got to was that in order to balance those information demands from primary users, cost benefits, and the availability of methods and support, etc., the 1-year guidance was considered appropriate. So, for example, as Karen mentioned, those service organisation control reports from the third-party data providers are expected to be provided within the year. So, really that type of information was incredibly useful for us to be able to think about these issues of timing. Quite a few people talked about benefits of aligning timing for some of these requirements with other jurisdictions, particularly Australia. But what we really, understood when we were reading those desires for more time was really it was not just about timing, it was about the substantive disclosure requirement because, for example, anticipated financial impacts has a very different disclosure requirement in Australia than it does here. So we really think these are important questions that we want to consider more in 2025. So rest assured that they are definitely on our radar. So we have raced through because we really wanted to give lots of time for questions. As I said, the amending standards are on the link here. You can always email us. Please do sign up to get our climate alerts, audit and assurance, etc. alerts. So I will stop sharing my screen and you can have back to Karen and I. I think Karen has said, please add any questions into the chat. I can't see any Q&A. But yeah, please do ask us any questions. We have, I guess while I'm waiting to see if any questions come through, I'll give a little bit of more detail around some of the timetables for that guidance. So we are working really hard on kind of an additional bit of guidance on transition planning that will be at some point next year folded into the guidance for all sectors for the NZCS regime. But we're aiming to just publish that bit about the disclosure around transition planning separately, so it's easy for you to pick up as a separate bit of information, so you know what's been made available. We've got some work coming on Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions disclosures, and that's really designed to be read both by preparers and assurance practitioners to kind of help you when there may be sources of tension between different ideas about what is or isn't needed to be disclosed. And I will just give a little shout out to the FMA. So their monitoring report is coming out really soon on their first year of monitoring the climate related disclosure regime, and I know that they also have some webinars coming up to explain that monitoring report, so you can sign up to those on their website. All right, can you tell us when the financial impacts guidance will be out, Jessica? Yes, so it won't be out in December, but we're aiming for that to be out in Q1 2025. So really trying to prioritise some of that, but again, make that really practical and useful for you. So yes, that will come out. If you have any particular questions on that guidance, let us know. What we do tend to do with guidance is we do get external review because we want to make sure that it's readable. It's not just Karen and I writing what we, all the other staff think is the most appropriate. So yeah, if you think that you would have something useful to say around external review of our documents, would be great. Okay, I've answered that one. Oh, sorry, I'm supposed to be handing over to you, Karen. You're supposed to be doing this facilitation.
That's okay. So the second question is around, will the further guidance around assurance address expectations, realities around Scope 3 data uncertainty? And the answer to that is yes. So we're currently working on drafting some guidance on Scope 3 emissions disclosure. And as we have said previously, we're looking at the guidance from sort of prepare a kind of assurance practitioner perspective. And yes, it will address uncertainties and data uncertainties as part of that guidance. And the next question, if you disclose some of your Scope 3 and take the adoption provision for the remaining Scope 3, can you get the portion of your Scope 3 still assured? Yes, you can choose to get your disclosed Scope 3 assured. That is your decision as the entity to decide to get your Scope 3 emissions disclosure assured. Another question, Amelia, I think this one's for you. How do we manage the tension between XRB's comfort with disclosures being iterative and CRE's exposure to greenwashing risk investor concerns? Tricky one.
I would definitely say on that one, the disclosures were designed to be principles based. They're designed to have quite a bit of judgment in there because we knew it was a new regime, and that you would be kind of thinking about what was material, because the whole point is it all rests on what is material information to your primary user. So I definitely would say you do want to make sure that you have, you've done good record keeping around those judgments around material information. There's definitely going to be some, and that's why the FMA has the educative and learning approach in the first, years of the regime. But it is, if you think that some information is greenwashing, I would be documenting that judgment and not be putting that out. So there will always be some aspects of the disclosure that, as Karen mentioned, will be uncertain and will have estimation uncertainty, and that is what the principles in NZCS3 are designed for. They're designed to explain that, and they're also the requirements around methods and assumptions and data and estimation uncertainty are designed to help that. So I have always said, I really hope that everyone takes this very seriously and does, and we have absolutely seen that. We think people have put a huge amount of work into their disclosures, but obviously the sophistication will raise over time. So that's kind of what we mean by being iterative. You will always need to focus on what the standards require, but the sophistication will come through. So I would just say it is really about that two-way conversation between you and your primary user about what information is material. That should be really, really helpful.
Amelia, there's a couple of questions in the chat. So what can we expect in terms of future alignment with Australian standards?
Definitely, international alignment is definitely a really important part for us when we do standard setting in all of our areas, so across accounting, audit and assurance, and climate. We are very keen to see reporting done. So what we don't tend to want to do is align standards necessarily without thinking about, well, what does the reporting look like? So we can't, make any judgments on the quality of other standards until we see what the reporting is that comes out the other side of it. So we spend an awful lot of time engaging with Australia and with other jurisdictions to think about what they're doing. So I can't give you a particular timetable, but it's definitely something that we have on the agenda for 2025. We really want to hear from entities about what does international alignment mean to you. We have a lot of entities, obviously, that operate in Australia, but then there are European standards, there are American standards coming, there are Chinese standards coming, there are Indian standards coming. There's a lot of standards out there. And so what international alignment means and is actually best for New Zealand is something that we are acutely aware of needing to understand.
Thank you. And one here around transition planning. If an entity takes the position that they are already in a state that it can address climate risks and opportunities, and there is nothing to transition to, is a transition plan still needed?
What I would say in that point, so the addressing of the risks and opportunities, that is your transition planning. So, your actions, your targets, your strategic direction around responding to your climate-related risks and opportunities, that is the transition planning. So that is what you would disclose.
Thank you. And one last question around, could you please clarify whether the 1-year extension for the adoption of Scope 3 greenhouse gas GHG emissions disclosure applies to the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions of fund investee companies for MIS license holders? So, yeah.
I understand that is so the Scope 1 and 2 emissions of the entities into which you invest in as a fund manager, they are your Scope 3 emissions. So yes, they would be covered by that exemption.
Thank you. Is there any thinking around aligning to AASB's allowance for Scope 3 GHG to be reported for the reporting period that is not the current reporting period due to data unavailability?
Right, so this comes down to, if I understand this correctly, comes down to interesting questions around timing. So what data is considered timely? Shall I hand this one back over to you, Karen?
Yeah, so that is something that we are looking at as part of our guidance, and is just the sort of timeliness of data to be included within greenhouse gas disclosures. So it is something that we're thinking about currently as part of writing that disclosure.
Definitely, you can't disclose data that you don't have.
Yes, exactly.
So
yeah.
it's we're definitely wanting people to obviously get good quality data, but if data doesn't exist, it doesn't exist.
I think maybe all of the questions that we have.
And there's some more in the chat, I think.
There's some in there. So there's some chatter around climate standards being reviewed to make mandatory reporting requirements not so onerous for smaller listed companies. Is there any truth to this?
So definitely the XRB is really interested in right-sizing our disclosure requirements for the entities that are required to report. So we wrote NZCS with the breadth of entities in mind. You know, we have very different entities captured in our regime. And so that was the point of them being, you know, principles based. And so definitely for us, so we've always said, you know, we would be looking to begin our post implementation review next year. And one of those things was looking at, you know, international alignment, as I've talked about before, but secondly, also, you know, trends and what's happening in other jurisdictions. And so what is happening in other jurisdictions is this idea of some form of reduced disclosure, differential disclosure, tiered reporting. So in Europe, for example, they have the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, and then they are also doing work on something called their listed SME standard, which is for smaller listed issuers. And then they also have something around, it's called a VSME. So voluntary for SMEs. There's this kind of this idea is happening in lots of other jurisdictions. So we're paying really close attention to that, and that is something that we do want to you know, understand more of next year, because that's part of our kind of international alignment work and making sure that the disclosure requirements meet the needs of New Zealand entities and also meet the kind of purpose of the primary legislation here.
Thank you. There's just a question about the FMA's monitoring report and whether the XRB will respond to the FMA monitoring report at all.
We won't do a formal response to the monitoring report. I know the FMA team were hoping to be at this webinar, but they're very busy, obviously, finishing up their monitoring report. Rest assured that we have seen that monitoring report and have provided our input into that. So yeah, we're really, you know, congratulations to the FMA team for the big job that they've had this year.
And we have a question about Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions for MIS managers. So the requirement around the assurance for Scope 1 and Scope 2 assurance is in the legislation. So that is something that is currently required under the current legislation. So yeah, so that's sort of, yeah. I guess I don't know if you want to add anything more to that,
Is this
Amelia.
one about the benefit of S1 and S2 being assured? Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So is there any benefit of S1 and Scope 1 and 2 being assured for MIS managers? It seems like a big expense for something that is minimal. So yeah, as Karen says, if you have material, you know, if you have disclosed, if you have emissions that are needed to be disclosed, you would have to have them assured. So for MIS managers, you might want to have a look at back at some of the reporting that some of the MIS managers have lodged on the climate related disclosures register at the company's office. So if you actually don't have any material emissions, then you wouldn't get those assured because they're not material emissions. So is there anything else you want to add on that one, Karen?
No, I think that covers it really. I think, yeah,
Yep.
just, yeah, yeah. This one is a little bit specific around Scope 3 emissions categories. One of our Scope 3 emissions categories exceeds 98% of all Scope 3 emissions. What methodology do you recommend to cut off due to materiality? I would say under our standards, that's not something that we're really sort of recommending. I think it would be just a judgment call under whichever standard that you or whichever methodology that you're using to prepare your Scope 3 emissions. So just following the most appropriate or best representative method to calculate those emissions.
So just a reminder that the standards in New Zealand, we don't require any specific measurement methodology to be used. So you can use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, you can use PCAF, you can use ISO, you can use whatever you want. And so you must look at the measurement requirements in that measurement standard for, you know, what you do to make those judgment calls, for example, around 98%. But it's the disclosure requirements in the New Zealand standards, NZCS. So you use the disclosure requirements in our standards.
Is there any intention to revise the scenarios that entities are required to consider, i.e. the 1.5 degree scenario, which based on current science now seems unachievable?
So obviously all of the disclosure requirements will be looked over with a fine-tooth comb when it comes to that review. It's interesting to note, that the scenarios are, for example, in the Australian legislation, have been specified in primary legislation. So they are stuck for, the entities over there. We are, the point of having the 1.5, the greater than 3, and then a third had multiple kind of reasons behind it. That we wouldn't have a good or a bad scenario. So you'd be like, well, everything's going to be great in this one and not great in this one. And then also the fact that there's supposed to be kind of extremes of your wind tunnel. Your strategy is the plane that you're putting in that wind tunnel to kind of test it and see how resilient it is going to be to kind of future climate uncertainty. So in a 1.5 degree scenario, you probably, you would have less physical climate risk, but you would have significant transition risk potentially because, to achieve a 1.5 degree world, as you say, I'm hoping it's not unachievable, but it would be a significant change in terms of, how we operate as a global economy. So what would it look like to have no fossil fuels available? How would your strategy work? Where would you get your product from, etc.? That's the point, of that scenario. So I think even if people think that it's not achievable, the point of the scenario, which is to really strongly test the transition risk and the physical risk, in that world, because there's still physical risk in a 1.5 degree future, that still holds true. But so having said all that, we definitely do want to, make sure that the disclosures are still relevant and usable.
Thank you. And just one more question around guidance, whether there is likely to be any further guidance around materiality, especially for climate risks and opportunities.
We will definitely be looking to update the guidance for all sectors next year. That's both for the MIS managers and for the other corporate, etc. entities. What I would say on materiality, is really it is about trying to hone in on those risks and opportunities that are the most material, that really are key for you. What I would say is we have seen trends globally for fewer climate-related risks and opportunities to be disclosed, where people started off having, a list of 20 plus risks and opportunities. We're seeing it get down into definitely the single digits, if not, 5 or fewer. But that often seems to be entities that are more mature on their climate, related disclosure journey. I'm not saying that is relevant for everyone on this call, but that is definitely the trend we are seeing. So, what we do in that guidance for all sectors is try to link to useful documents or examples of things that people might want to look at. So that's probably what we would do on materiality rather than something very specific about making materiality judgments. I think that's everything, Karen.
I think it is.
While we are available to you that you would like to quickly pop in the chat. And if not, as we said, there's always, you can always email us climate@xrb.govt.nz. Please do sign up on our website for the alerts, etc. We really do want to make sure that everyone is getting the information. Follow us on LinkedIn. And thank you all for coming. We really appreciated having you on the call. Ka kite anō.